Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation on flying foxes and Hendra virus. My name is Michael Walsh and I'm a landscape epidemiologist at the University of Sydney, where I work on emerging infectious diseases, and in particular those diseases that spill over from animal populations like wildlife and domestic animals to humans. So today we're going to talk about the human impacts of flying fox, the human impacts on flying fox habitat and potential consequences for Hendra virus spillover, and how we can think about fighting disease with conservation. So before we start, I thought it would be helpful to get a sense of some of the vocabulary and language so that we're all on the same page as we proceed. So we're going to talk about zoonoses and what that means. Zoonoses are infections in animals that can be transmitted to humans. There's often a natural reservoir in wild animals, and I'll talk more about what a reservoir is in a moment. Infections in animals may circulate at some base level all the time or at regular intervals, and we would call this kind of infection enzootic. Okay, infections in animals may sometimes occur above what would be considered a normal level, and we would call this kind of infection epizootic. And this is analogous to an epidemic in humans. So both enzootic and epizootic infections in animals can lead to zoonoses in humans, depending on how and when we are exposed. Ecosystem changes can promote expansion of a reservoir host, and as the host's geographic range, and these changes can lead to new exposures for humans. So spillover specifically, when a pathogen is transmitted from an animal in which it occurs in nature, which we would refer to as a reservoir, to a domestic animal or to humans, we call this event a spillover. Okay, so the reservoir is where the pathogen, whether that pathogen is a virus or a bacterium, where it occurs in nature. You can think of the reservoir as being where it lives in nature. And if this pathogen spills over from its reservoir to a new animal, to a domestic animal, to humans, we call that event a spillover. Now, epidemiology is a process that is going to be running through this presentation, and it's a science that is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease, or really any health event for that matter. Okay, so as the distribution of disease, we're interested in where things are happening, we're interested in when they're happening, and we're interested in whom these events are occurring. Okay, so we can think of person, time, and place. And if we think about an infectious disease happening in a particular landscape where we live, we can think about that landscape as being comprised of layers. Okay, so for example, if we look at this picture here, we can see at the far left, we see a grouping of environmental factors, things like temperature, precipitation, land use, how we use the land. Is the land used for agriculture? Is it urban development? Is it open natural habitat? Within the landscape, there are also occurring different species, different animal species, which may be they may be reservoir hosts for particular pathogens. There may be vectors, vectors are organisms that transmit infections between animals or between humans, for example, mosquitoes or ticks. These different layers in the landscape, when taken together, define risk to humans for the particular pathogen that we're interested in. Okay, and then we can observe cases as they occur based upon how we capture those cases through reporting and through surveillance, etc. Now, this slide here is a somewhat complex configuration of different factors that may influence our human health. Okay, so for example, if you look at the right side of this graph, we have negative health outcomes. This is human health outcomes, and we have on the left different factors that may influence those health outcomes. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're really talking about infectious diseases, and we're specifically talking about Hendra. But there are various environmental factors like land use and land cover changes in particular in these different aspects of the landscape, as well as climate change. This is another aspect that may influence human health outcomes. Resource scarcity, okay, water scarcity, the availability, the availability of good soils, for example, for crop growth. If we have an overall deterioration in ecosystem services, this can ultimately impact our human health. Now, you can see these concentric rings here around the general theme of human health, and these can act as buffers or insulating layers to protect us from external factors in the environment. However, eventually, the insulating layers are going to run out. Now, at the greatest, at the most peripheral layer here, we have a fully functioning, healthy ecosystem in which, we do not experience vulnerability. But as the ecosystem erodes, so too do these insulating layers also erode, and ultimately then we become susceptible to the downstream negative health effects that these external or environmental deteriorating ecosystem services effect. So we're going to talk more specifically now about Hendra virus spillover. Hendra virus is an emerging pathogen of concern in Australia, given its severe disease in horses and humans. Transmission from the natural reservoir hosts, which are flying foxes, to horses and onto humans. So basically, we have a pathogen here that exists in nature in flying foxes, and subsequently has the potential to spill over to horses and then subsequently to humans with severe outcomes. Now, we do have a sense of the epidemiology and ecology of Hendra virus spillover. So we know that there are specific human pressures such as urbanization and habitat fragmentation or habitat loss, and that these influence spillover risk by influencing the bat ecology and increasing the potential contact ultimately between these bats and domestic animals and also humans. So here's your adorable picture for the day. We've got some baby flying foxes here looking very cute and adorable, except perhaps not so cute to horses who may be terrified given the potential for Hendra virus spillover. But the reality is the point from a virus in flying foxes to an infection occurring in a horse is complex, and there are several layers in the landscape that are going to determine how the pathogen flows from bats to horses and then potentially ultimately to humans. So, for example, you first have to have the flying foxes in the environment, okay? And secondly, you have to have infection in the flying foxes. Given that there may be infection in the flying foxes, you then have to have shedding of the virus into the environment. You can see that in the second layer here in this graph. Once you have shedding of the virus, there has to be some level of survival of that virus outside the host. In other words, it has to be able to be maintained in the environment, at least for some period of time, so that that horses can then subsequently be infected. Okay, if you have horses in that environment in which the virus was shed, there can be potential for exposure. But then, of course, there's going to be variability in susceptibility among the horses before you have some of them with ultimate infection. Now, as you can see in this picture here, there's further layers of infection ecology that are relevant. For example, viral load, so how much virus is occurring in a particular bat population at a particular time. That's going to influence how much they are shedding into the environment and where they're shedding that into the environment. You've also got the specifics of horse exposure, things like particular husbandry practices, animal husbandry practices, the quality of the pasture, the foraging of horses under tree, the quality of the forage for bats in trees, as well as roosting in trees, horse behavior in the context and in the locations of these trees and roosting or foraging bats, and then specific susceptibilities of the horses themselves and immunogenicity. So we conducted a study recently on Hendra virus in which we wanted to ask the question, is Hendra virus spillover dependent on the changing habitat of reservoir flying foxes? So in Australia today, between 1994 and 2015, there were 55 spillover events, Hendra virus spillover events, that were recorded in Queensland and New South Wales. And you can see on this map in red, the dots, red dots represent the location of these spillovers. Here we're focusing on where these spillovers have been concentrated. So that's in southeastern Queensland and northeastern New South Wales. Now this graph here, without going into the technical details, is showing essentially, if you look at the black sort of zigzaggy line on top and the red dashed line beneath that, the fact that these two lines are separated, are distinctly separate from each other, shows that where the Hendra virus spillovers are occurring is highly spatially dependent. That means there's something that's occurring in the landscape that's determining where these spillovers are happening. And so we wanted to try to understand why. What's causing this spatial dependence? So we wanted to look at the distribution of humans in specific forest or in specific landscapes, and how the distribution of humans may subsequently be influencing the distribution of flying foxes, and how the distribution of flying foxes is influencing the distribution of Hendra virus spillovers. So we first asked, how has flying fox habitat changed in response to human pressure? Okay, so what we did was we took 3 decades, 1980 to 1989, 1990 to 1999, and 2000 to 2015, and we looked at how the human population has changed over these 3 decadal time periods, okay? And in particular, how the movement of human population has changed over these time periods. So there are 4 species of flying fox in mainland Australia, as I'm sure you all know. There's the gray-headed flying fox, the black flying fox, the little red, and the spectacled. And there are 2, while all four of these species are susceptible to infection with Hendra virus, but there is strong evidence now that suggests that really only 2 species are responsible for shedding most of the virus into the environment, which can then subsequently cause infection in horses. And these 2 species are the black flying fox and the spectacled flying fox. So our group studied the influence of these human population pressure on these 2 species in particular. So we have the black flying fox, Pteropus alecto, and we have observations of the species between 1980 to 2015. And then we also have the spectacled flying fox, also observed over the same period. Now this species has has a lot less, I should say, observations, because its geographical range within Australia is much less than the black flying fox. But nevertheless, we also were interested in looking at this species because the viral shedding, the hendrovirus shedding of this species, also appears to be significant in terms of potential for spillover. So what we observed was that as human population changed from 1980 through 2015, we saw a concurrent shift in the habitat suitability, or the suitable habitat for flying fox, with an ultimate shifting southward of ideal flying fox habitat. And that's the flying fox habitat for those 2 species, the 2 potential reservoir species. So the extent of flying fox habitat, the geographic extent that is, from 1990 to 2000, had 4 times greater risk of hendrovirus spillover than did the habitat from 2 decades earlier. And just to show you again the graph showing the dependency, the dependency of hendrovirus spillovers, when we look at the graph on the on the left, this is the same graph that I showed you initially. Once we account for the changing flying fox habitat, which is changing in response to the human pressures, population pressures, we find that the spatial dependency is largely accounted for. So what that's saying is that really the largest contribution to where the hendrovirus spillovers are happening is due to the human pressures that are being placed on flying fox habitat. So, in summary, human population pressure appears to influence changing flying fox habitat. And this changing bat habitat is strongly associated with hendrovirus spillover and where it's happening. Now, additional studies have also shown that the integrity of bat populations may be very important in promoting healthy bat communities and preventing high viral shedding at the locations of roosts. So, for example, here we can see these 2 graphs are showing that as connectivity among the overall bat population, as this connectivity decreases, what we're seeing is there's an increase in the size of the circulation of hendrovirus outbreaks among the bat populations. Okay, so what this is suggesting is that ultimately healthy bat communities mean connected bat communities. So as we break up bat populations, flying fox populations, as we create fragmented flying fox populations, what we're ultimately doing is creating more opportunities for larger hendrovirus outbreaks among the bats and then ultimately shedding into the environment. So, therefore, very important to work toward reducing the fragmentation of flying fox habitat. So, what are the implications of this work? Well, ultimately, we conceive of ecosystem management in light of the results of this, but in light of the results of other research that we've talked about, we conceive of ecosystem management as public health intervention, and we foster, in the context of such ecosystem management, a One Health approach or a One Health perspective. So what do I mean by One Health perspective? Well, this is a health perspective that addresses human, animal, and ecosystem health collectively, simultaneously, so that our efforts are aimed at outcomes that benefit all three. And what this means is that we need to work together across different interests and occupations in any application of public health intervention, in any application of ecosystem management as public health intervention. As a realistic example, can property management adopt a One Health approach to prevention of Hendra virus spillover approach? So as an example, there was a survey that was conducted to identify practices among horse owners, practices in prevention of Hendra virus among their horses. So the survey asked different behavioral practices such as covering horse feed, covering water to protect from exposure to bat urine or bat feces, different practices in having horses in and off pasture when flying foxes are around and present. And there was sizable proportions of the participants in the survey that did not practice some of these prevention methods. And when the survey explored further reasons for not participating in specific prevention methods, for example, covering horse feed or covering water, most often the reasons for not participating were money or practicality. Okay, so there are very real reasons why particular behaviors among horse owners may not be implemented. They may not be feasible. However, when the survey queried further and tried to identify options or conduits for increasing particular behaviors, they identified that there were quite a few that were willing to adopt behaviors given certain circumstances. For example, if one of their horses was found to be positive for Hendra virus, or a horse on a neighboring property, or, and this is particularly interesting, if government funding was available. So, in wrapping up, I would like to just briefly outline some different concepts for intervention and how these may or may not work together, and also to present pros and cons for each of these. So first off, we have ecological interventions. These are instances of primary prevention, which are the most upstream approach. That means you're trying to tackle the problem at the source. For example, these may include additional protection of wildlife and ecosystems with added direct benefits. Direct benefits, in other words, reducing exposure to Hendra virus, or indirect benefits, which could include reducing exposure to as yet unknown pathogens or diseases. Okay, so if you think back to prior to 1994, we didn't know about Hendra virus. Okay, there hadn't been any documented spillovers up to that point. So the question is, what exists out there now that we don't know about, that we are putting ourselves at risk for by putting pressures on wildlife habitat. Now, one potential con here is that this type of an ecological intervention cannot reduce exposure by acting alone. Okay, we must work together with the broader community in a collaborative effort for ecological interventions to work. behavioral interventions. So here we can reduce individual exposure by blocking contact between bats and horses. And this is essentially what I was talking about with the survey that I presented in a few slides ago. So this allows for protective intervention of horses, for example, by covering feed, fencing off trees where flying foxes are roosting. And this has the added benefit of limiting disturbance to bats. So you're kind of leaving them alone while protecting the horses with particular behavioral interventions that block potential exposure. The potential con here is that this does not eliminate potential exposure entirely, as roosting and foraging flying foxes are remaining on site, because the ultimate aim here is to protect the horses while not disturbing the bats. Vaccination is another approach. Risk of infection here can be reduced dramatically. Adverse effects associated with the vaccination are low. However, there is a cost, and there are risk and safety perceptions that may need to be addressed as well. Culling as the final approach here. You'll notice that I have no pros. This is all cons. So here we have the removal of the reservoir, but this removal of the reservoir only removes the exposure from an individual site. Okay, disturbing the broader flying fox population by culling individual roosts, on the other hand, may cause the population as a whole to shed more virus into the environment and actually increase exposure in other areas. And then finally, loss of flying fox populations, individual populations at best, and whole species at worst, can both have devastating impacts on ecosystem health at large and may in fact introduce new threats to human and domestic animal health. So three of these approaches can work well together: the ecological, the behavioral, and the vaccine approaches, while one approach works against the other three, and that is culling. So that concludes this presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it has been helpful.